Uh, Thank you. Who will want can see it on our YouTube channel later on. So thanks so much for coming today. It is a big honor for us. I've read your exciting book, The 100-Year Life. Found it very interesting also from a personal standpoint. Just a few words. I'm Milan Musho. I'm the president of the Cambridge University Longevity Society, which we formed exactly for that reason of interdisciplinarity of aging, that we believe this is a sort of multidisciplinary problem to bring together scientists, entrepreneurs, and policymakers to be able to come together and talk about aging and what it means for us. This event is our second in the aging webinar series. So we had Marco Quarta before, and also in May, we're going to have Melike Donertas also, to tell us more about her journey in aging research, which actually started also here in Cambridge. Apart from that, we also organize socials and have some in-person events. Apparently, you also know Andrew Steele, who's given a talk for us previously. So please check out the Facebook group, and you can find all our events there. So today I'll lead the discussion with Andrew. I think that should last around 30 or 35 minutes. So we have plenty of time for questions. So please post those in the chat. Brendan, our secretary for the society, he will then read them out loud. He will ask you to read them out loud if you'd like. If not, please indicate that in the chat. So now with all this sorted, we can get started. So Professor Andrew John Scott is a professor of economics at London Business School. His award-winning research, writing, and speaking focuses on economic and financial implications of longevity and aging for society, markets, and also individuals. He's the co-author of The 100-Year Life, The New Long Life, and co-founder of the Longevity Forum, a member of the WEF Council on Healthy Aging and Longevity, and a consulting scholar at Stanford Center on Longevity. So Andrew, welcome here. Can we?
I was on mute to begin with. Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So a privilege to be here.
Same here. So before we get into all the details of your work and your opinions, I would like to know, what is it that brought you to aging research originally? That's always an interesting question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So thank you. It's such a great place to start, and I'm surprised I don't get asked that more often. So there's a bunch of reasons, I guess. One is just what drives me and why I'm an academic is I love ideas, but I love ideas that have an impact. That's what always drives me. So, wow, fantastic, isn't it? Longevity. There's ideas then come much bigger and the impact is enormous. And also what I like about it too is I think it's certainly in my area in economics, but I think more generally, it's a subject that people have just got wrong. So, hey, we've got something that's really big, really important, and people have got it wrong. So that's one set of reasons. I think on a personal level, I'm going to talk later about the 100-year life and multi-stage lives. But I was also just bored doing what I've been doing for 20 odd years. I was a very standard macroeconomist, looking at interest rates and fiscal policy, advising various governments and central banks. But there's only so long you can talk about whether interest rates are going to go up or go down. And much as I still love the discipline and find it interesting, I just wanted to do something new. And then, I think for me, what's lovely about longevity, and I'm glad you mentioned it, is just its breadth. It's wonderfully multidisciplinary. And I think unless we take a multidisciplinary approach to it, and an interdisciplinary approach, we're not going to succeed. And then, why longevity itself, apart from all those reasons, I think two personal motivations. One, I was just watching my kids in their 20s just do things very differently from what I did. And of course, I did it differently from my parents. But it got me thinking why, and that got me onto longevity. And I think the real crystallizing moment for me, there's lots of reasons, but I give a lecture course at London Business School called World Economy, Problems and Prospects. It's a bit longer on the problems these days than the prospects, but I would give a lecture on an aging society, and you probably come across it. It's a terribly miserable topic. We've got all these old people. Old people are a problem. They get ill. They don't work. They're a burden. And it was remorselessly negative. It was sort of spreadsheet projections of just birth rates and death rates. And then there was one slide in the middle of this lecture that said, on average, we're living longer and we're healthier for longer. It's like, how do we turn that into a bad news story? And it was really that moment that got me the switching from thinking about an aging society to what I call a longevity society.
Thanks a lot. That's a very interesting journey. I agree. There is a lot of sort of grim news in the media about the aging tsunami. We can touch upon that later. So I'd like to get started with your recent publication. Well, I guess not that recent anymore, the economic value of targeting aging, where you talk about some potential benefits of targeting aging, of aging research. So what are these benefits and where are they stemming from?
Right. So another big question. So this is joint work with Martin Ellison from Oxford University, an economist who I've long worked with, and David Sinclair, lifespan author in Harvard Medical School. And having spent quite a bit of time in the longevity world, I was a little bit frustrated. How do we get people not take it seriously? Because of course they do take it seriously, but how do I get, for me, ministries of finance to get this interested? Part of my journey in this world is talking to lots of fascinating, interesting people, and then saying, right, how do we get something done? And in my past life in economics, macroeconomics, you just go to the Ministry of Finance or the central bank. But this just isn't on their radar. So I was thinking, well, how do we try and calculate these economic benefits? And there's three ways of doing it. So one is to think, what's the impact of GDP? I said earlier that we're living longer, healthier lives. That should be good for GDP. Every previous increase in health has been good for GDP. I see no reason why it shouldn't be for older people. So I have a big ESSC grant. I'm trying to work on that. But actually, it's hard to come up with a number because, of course, longer lives require so many different ways of thinking about how you read your education, what does it do to innovate. But there just isn't an economic model yet that has all the channels in. So I don't think we can come up with good answers yet about what it means for GDP, but I'm convinced it's positive. It's just coming up with the models to really quantify it. The second thing, which I see a lot of in health, is to say, well, what are the savings? If we could get people to age better, then we wouldn't spend so much on dementia and hip replacements, etc., and we'd save billions. And I kind of see where that's coming from, but I'm not terribly keen on that approach because I actually think that aging better is so valuable that even if we have to spend more money than we currently do on health, it's worth it. Which is really the third approach, which is in economics. I think a lot of people, particularly actually in the medical world, think that to estimate economic benefits, you look at what the impact is of something on the economy. But that's not at all how economics think. We just calculate the dollar value of everything in a way. And so we have economic tools that calculate the willingness to pay or the dollar value of improvements in health and life expectancy. So that's the approach we took in the paper. Let's take these models, and quite sophisticated ones, and say, let's try and put a dollar value on different ways of aging better. And so, of course, in that paper, we went through a whole bunch of different scenarios. We came up with 4 characters, Strudbergs, who live longer but not in better health, a little bit kind of on the path we're on at the moment. Dorian Gray, where you don't live for longer, you just live healthier, you have a compression and morbidity. Peter Pan, where you slow down biological aging, so you get benefits to life expectancy and health. And then a Wolverine example, which David was keen to put in, where you actually reverse aging, you actually reverse biological age. And then we sort of just ran a whole bunch of tests on this, and lots of stuff comes out of it. But here's sort of the punchlines, and I'm sure it won't be surprising to anyone here. The value of aging well is enormous. I mean, I think we come up with one number, which is $37 trillion for the US in present value terms for one more year of life expectancy through slowing down aging. So huge numbers. Secondly, we show that the most important thing to do is to compress morbidity. It'd be better right now to get health span to match lifespan completely before increasing life expectancy anymore. But then the real thing for me is this focus on targeting aging itself and how that unlocks a number of really important things. And for me, that's the real value of the paper. And in fact, we're working on a follow-up to try and bring it out. The debate about living longer or being healthier for longer, there's a complementarity. The longer I live, but the longer I've got worse health, then of course I want to compress morbidity. But as I get health span to catch up with lifespan, then I want to live longer. So there's going to be this sort of constant catch up. We increase life expectancy, then we focus on getting healthier for longer. But when we're healthier for longer, we then want to live for longer. So there's these very important synergies that keep the return to aging well high. Then if you look at just targeting aging itself, so trying to slow down biological age, there's some other complementarities that are, again, pretty obvious. The first one is, of course, that if you can target and slow down aging, then you have an effect on many age-related diseases rather than just a single disease. So, of course, you scoop up larger benefits because you're aggregating across many things. But also, there's a thing called competing risks in health. And, of course, what's going to happen is if you could tackle cancer, you don't get much extra life expectancy because there's lots of other diseases that affect you. Age-related diseases, and your health is actually often quite poor. Whereas if you can slow down aging, you get better health for longer, and so you get more valuable life because you're in a better health. So combine those two things together, you get really big numbers. But to me, the real insight of the paper is that there's a virtuous circle around aging, which doesn't exist with any other form of health breakthrough. So what the paper really says is the following: we're at a new stage of life where the biggest health challenges are now age-related diseases. When you had high infant mortality, that was clearly the most important thing for a country to focus on. Then when you sort of made progress there, you'd focus on midlife mortality. Now, given the survival curves, given the chances of living a long life, it's all about age-related diseases. But what is different about age-related diseases and aging is the better we get at aging, the more we value further improvements in aging. And that's different from, say, infant mortality. If you improve infant mortality, you suddenly no longer are interested in infant mortality because you've solved it. You move on to the next problem. But there is this virtuous circle around aging that says the better we get at aging, the more we're going to be interested in aging better. And that is sort of, I think, what is remarkable here, because that's a situation we're in at the moment. And everyone has a very static idea about life. I don't want to reach 80 because I'll be ill. But if you can be well in your 80s, then you're going to want to live into your 90s. So this then points to really quite dramatic change, I think, in human history, where for the first time ever, the young can now expect to become old, which means that the biggest health risk is about age-related diseases. And that is going to be what we're going to focus on. And the better we get at it, the more valuable further improvements are. So that's quite a transformative moment for human history. So that's what I would see as the economic value. How do we put dollar value on health gains? We've had to do that with COVID. We know that health matters enormously. And we just show that it's a multi-trillion-dollar imperative to try and age better.
Well, thanks for that opinion. I mean, yeah, I have not thought of that actually. There is no real end to the aging research unless we reach some biological limit, perhaps. But perhaps.
Well, what's interesting is if you do hit the biological limit, it just increases the value even more because you want to try and break through it. But it does suggest, I mean, I'm not offering here any numbers or any dates. I'm a classic economist here, but just logically, yeah, this just says we will be putting more and more resources into it.
So given these benefits, or given all the reasons you've outlined why it might be a good idea, why do you think the aging funding is so limited compared to other diseases or the disease-specific approaches? And yeah, what are the barriers there?
I mean, obviously, in the Nature paper, we show that it's a multi-trillion-dollar benefit. I mean, you've got to multiply that by the probability of success. So, if you think the probability of success is 0.001, then it doesn't matter if you're $37 trillion, it's still going to be a handful of change. So it may just be people think it's not feasible. New ideas take time, and this is such an interesting idea, isn't it? Because in some ways it's not new. Through time immemorial, there's been people who have said, hey, I'm going to defeat aging and make you live forever. And they've been seen as quacks, and they were mostly quacks. So I think there's a sort of a challenge there. It is a radical new idea in so many ways, not just the sort of science of aging, but this notion that age is malleable. We really struggle with it. And as I say, if you think about the progress we've made so far, it's really about getting the majority of people to live a long life. But we're now talking about something different. We're now talking about changing how people age and then potentially going to live a lot longer. And that is such a radically different way of thinking. So I think that there's just a conceptual framework, which also mars in with a certain skepticism. It's early days, let's see. I mean, clearly it's underfunded, but do you really yet want to switch big funds away from cancer, etc.? It's still early days. And then I think there's always something else to be concerned about. I mean, there's lots of other issues demanding our time and attention right now. But I also think, as I'm sure you've talked about before in this group, we have a disease approach to health. I mean, I still think it's a great irony that the World Health Organization produces the International Classification for Diseases. They're sort of, they're really the opposite apart. And that disease perspective permeates all our attitude to how we treat people. It's about intervening when people get ill. And obviously, this approach is about keeping people well for longer. And I don't think it's about, is aging a disease? I mean, you can go down and have that debate, which I find rather unhelpful. But actually, if you have a longevity perspective, you're just moving away from a disease perspective and just thinking, how do I keep people healthy for longer? And of course, from that perspective, the debate about whether aging is a disease or not is pointless. It's just about health. That is such a different way of thinking about things. And then, of course, there's all sorts of vested interest, which it's, everyone has vested interest. I remember the business school, Professor Gary Hamill saying the hardest thing to do make any change is to get people who have been successful to abandon their human capital. And I think it's just really hard to reroute the way people think. So I think there's all those reasons. I suspect for the reasons that I talked about earlier, you're going to see more and more funding coming into this space. And I suspect you'll see a typical nascent industry where there'll be overfunding and people will be disappointed with results, and then the funding will scale back. Then there'll be a bit more of a breakthrough and the funding will increase. People will get a more nuanced idea about really what is happening, and it's not just reversing aging from the human body. It might be about cellular regeneration of the liver or something of that form. And then slowly it will cease to be something radically different and be something more conventional.
Yeah, I definitely agree. This focus on the overall health. Actually, I remember a book from the previous chief scientific officer, Whose Health Is It Anyways, where I think the author criticizes that even NHS is very sort of disease focused, and there could be a sort of more socioeconomic aspect to preventative care and actually education. And yeah.
Well, I think that's really interesting. And Matt Hancock, said to me once that the NHS, it's the national hospital system, not the national health system, which is, I think, is a good observation. But yeah, and I think what's so interesting here is that, for me, what's interesting about, so I run this thing called the Longevity Forum, which is a combination, bringing lots of different people together, like you're doing here, trying to get the word out outside of the longevity field. But it has involved me meeting with a lot more of the scientific researchers. And as a non-scientist, when you first hear the talk of what is happening, and I've seen it in David's lab, it is literally incredible. It sounds more science fiction than science. But of course, what it latches onto is this notion of age is malleable. And what I find so interesting is that we know that. I mean, everyone individually knows that if you eat too much, the wrong things, don't sleep enough, don't exercise, drink, smoke, it's bad for your health. You age more rapidly. Similarly, I'm often told that things like the book called The 100-Year Life, it's a wrong title because there's widening income inequality, which is absolutely true, and that's leading to widening life expectancy inequality. I can't think of a better statistic that tells me that aging is malleable than the difference in life expectancy between North and South Kensington is something like 15 years. I mean, it's clear that age is malleable. So I kind of hope that the sort of conceptual shock of the scientific research says, hey, we can make age more malleable than you can imagine, actually then just gets the social scientists and the policymakers to say, okay, true, but actually there's lots of other ways in which we can tackle aging, and the diversity with which we age and the way it's so clearly linked in part to individual behavior and socioeconomic determinants means that even if we haven't got the scientific results yet, there's loads of things that we can do. And if my paper with Martin and David shows just how valuable aging well is, it says, okay, this should be our focus. We should be focusing on plus 5 years of healthy life expectancy. How do we deliver it?
So the way you say it now, it sounds very rational approach, but I'd just like you to comment quickly, because the aging field often has a bit of a negative image, billionaires trying to live longer. We have other crises, the crisis of climate change currently, we have impending Great War potentially. So, how would you justify amongst all these other issues?
Yeah.
How do we spread the resources across these different issues?
Yeah, and obviously, so I think there's lots of problems with longevity, and one of them, I keep trying to use the word longevity rather than aging because I think we're so mixed up about the word aging. And just a sort of bit of a background before I answer your question. I interpret an aging society as a purely demographic event, which is that there's a demographic transition happening, there's a fall in the birth rate, people are living for longer, there's more old people than young people. So that's what I call an aging society. For me, and I wrote about this in a couple of Lancet articles, the longevity society is, for the first time ever, the young can now expect to become the old. And by old, I mean I live to 80 or 90. That was always a minority possibility. Now it's a majority possibility. So if you know you're going to, as a young person, reach 80 or 90, and that's pretty conventional. That's not building in anything of the sort of research that Sinclair and others are doing. You need to live your life differently. You need to just transform more things later into life. So that's what I talk about as longevity. Unfortunately, aging is always seen as what do we do with all these old people, not recognizing that young people become old. And it's just negative. It's seen as being about end of life, not all of life. It's based on so many age stereotypes that are at best incomplete and probably wrong, and a pretty poisonous approach to how society mixes intergenerationally. So that's one problem. Aging society. For instance, in a business school, I'm often told that Japan sells more adult diapers than baby diapers, as if that's it around longevity. So there's that problem. And then, of course, there's always more immediate problems. And I think if I look at the challenges that we face in society, there's obviously massive problems around inequality. We have a war conflict going on at the moment. We've got environmental problems, and we have AI. And society, humanity faces real existential risks now in a way that I don't think it's ever really done before in its history. And existential risks are obviously going to take a lot of precedence. However, I still think longevity, given the trillion-dollar values that my work places on it, needs to be at the heart of our health system. The UK health system, which is by no means the most funded, spends something like 14% of GDP in total on healthcare, if you look at it broadly defined. There's plenty of money to go around that can be used to fund this, even if there are lots of other competing needs. I think the problem is, how do we get people to recognize long-term challenges? Because this isn't about what I do with current 85-year-olds. It's what I do with current 50-year-olds or current 30-year-olds. for when they become 85. And as we've seen with climate change, that's tough to get people to recognize the link between current events and something far into the future has been a real challenge. So yeah, I'm not here to say it's the most important thing, but that said, I do think both individually and socially, it's right up there at the top, because in your own individual life, you know, I wanted to call the economic value of targeting aging paper all's well that ages well. That really is the situation now in these long lives. So it's right there at the top.
Right. Well, thanks for this opinion. I would move on now to your book, The 100-Year Life, which I read, and I was actually quite surprised. It's much more almost like a personal guidance I saw for life, and you know, in my early career life, I found it quite useful in terms of thinking about my future. But in this book, you describe, you go through the different stages of life and the areas of life with 3 different people born in different times, and then seeing how their work life, their relationship life changes. So you say we go from a 3-stage life to a multi-stage life. So what is the multi-stage life today, and where actually do you see yourself fitting in that?
Yeah, I'm sort of 3.5 stage life, I think.
Right.
So yeah, so let me come back to what I'm trying to do with and so I like your description of the book. It is, you know, it was I mean, it's been wildly successful. It's been a great, I think we sold 750,000 globally or something. So it's been a pleasant surprise how well the book has done. And for me, it was a sort of just doing something different, which I like to do. But it came from my lectures on the aging society. And again, in economics, look at the aging society story. It really is extraordinary. It says, you know, it turns one of the greatest success stories of the 20th century, the fact that we've got children getting through the early dangerous years of life. We've got more people getting through midlife. So we have fewer children to mourn, fewer parents snatched away in midlife, and more grandparents meeting their grandchildren. And then the economic analysis, oh, this is terrible. This is just awful. We can't afford it. And so it's all about affording it. And you go through the analysis and you say, well, people have to work longer. They're just going to have to work for longer, which I agree. I think they will. But based on the economic model is really no theory of aging. And there's no theory about how a longer life changes your behavior. And in that economic model, and I don't know if you've done economics, there's a thing called the life cycle hypothesis that really says there's a 3-stage life. You educate, then you have a career, then you retire. Now, if you just take that 3-stage model and just start plugging in some not implausible life expectancies, say 100. So the ONS says 1 in 5 girls born today will live to be 100. You know, you start working out that retirement age is going to happen at 80. That's some simple calculations. So you have a 60-year career. And I don't know, that just sounds pretty miserable to me, to work from 20 to 80 in the sort of way that my parents' career unfolded, and probably mine did too. It just sounds horrible. So really, my take on longevity as an economist is it's about having more time. And the mistake we make when we talk about an aging society is we all think about that's time at the end of life. Everyone always thinks these life expectancy gains come at the end of life, which it just isn't true. If anything, if you look at kind of where most of the gains have come from, it's kind of an extended middle age from 50 to 70. But, you know, you now have more time, so you'll do things differently. And that's about all of life. You know, if your day goes from 24 to 32 hours long, you don't think of it, oh, I've got 8 hours at the end of the day. You would structure your day differently. And just as we created teenagers and pensioners in the 20th century, so I think in response to the life expectancy gains we've got now, we're seeing new periods of life. So go back to my own kids who in their 20s were just not taking on all the adult responsibilities that I took on in my early 20s and my parents took on in their late teens. I mean, my father was literally never a teenager. Teenagers just weren't invented when he was a teenager, as it were. He started work at 14, he's married at 17, he's got a kid at 18 and a house at 19. He was never a teenager. I was a teenager, and I started then doing all those adult responsibilities sort of mid-20s. My kids late 20s, early 30s, I suspect. So we're seeing all shifts occur, and one of those is in your career, because if you are going to have to be working till you're 80, you're certainly not going to start work when you're 21. You're going to take longer to develop your adult skills, work out who you are, but also you're going to have a career that's made up of different stages. There may be transitions in between them, but sometimes you'll be working hard to make money. Other times you want a different work-life balance to perhaps care for your family, your children, or your parents, or just because you want a break. You're going to get bored doing one thing, you're going to shift to something else. So you're going to see a multi-stage life with lots of different changes of motivation. In the 100-year life, we sort of say that there's 4 things you've got to keep track of. There's your finances. And yes, working to your 80 solves the financial problem, but it's not a good life. Then there's your what we call productive assets, your skills and knowledge, the things that keep you engaged and help you have a career. And again, if you're working to your 80, you can't rely upon what you learn when you're 21. You're going to have to keep doing lifelong learning. And sometimes that might be small bits, sometimes it could be a big career break. Then there's your vitality assets, we call them, which is sort of twofold, your mental and physical health, and then your relationships. And both of those you have to invest in. And if you work really hard for 60 years, you won't have a 100-year life because your health will be very bad. Your mental health probably won't be great. And you certainly won't have good relationships. So you need to think about how you invest in all of these things. And then the final thing we talk about is what we call your transformational assets, your ability to deal with change and transition. Because of course, over a longer life, you will see more change and transition. And sometimes it'll be a choice you make. Other times it'll be a choice forced upon you, a situation forced upon you. So you need to work on all of those things. And if you have those 4 assets, your finances, your productive assets, your vitality assets, and your transformational assets, you have to have a multi-stage life, because there's no job that enables you to invest in all 4 of those at the same time. And so if you just have a 60-year career, your finances may be healthy, but your productive assets will be going negative. Your mental and physical health will be going negative, relationships, etc. So you'll have to shift and change. So that's the notion. It says retirement may not be when you stop work. You may carry on working part-time. You may start doing something entrepreneurial. You may start doing something charitable. But also there's a lot of things you do before then as well. So in terms of my own life, the younger you are, the more this multi-stage life is going to affect you, because there's also technology coming in as well. But certainly, if I look at my own life, I know that I'll be working way beyond retirement age for all sorts of reasons. As an academic, I'm quite lucky because retirement is a strange concept for academics. But also I've switched to in what I do. I've completely changed my research field as a consequence of longevity. It may not be the biggest transition compared to many others, but actually as an academic in around 50 to say, actually, I'm going to stop and completely retrain and retool because I'm bored with what I've done. That's a bit too fierce. I wasn't totally bored, but I just needed rejuvenation. I needed to do a new intellectual challenge. So yeah, I would say put me down for a 3.5 stage life.
Right, thank you. Yeah, perhaps the mental rejuvenation is maybe even more important. Yeah, having the purpose.
Yeah.
Would you say when we talk about these transformative assets, people being able to switch careers, and have sort of some maybe backup to be able to afford to take some time off work, retrain? Is this equally available across the sort of social classes? Probably not. What could be done to make this easier? Or
well, there's lots of things. Again, we need to redesign institutions to support a longer life. When retirement was introduced, it wasn't generally available to everyone, and then we introduced a pension that was limited to a certain number of people. Then it was extended, and now it's become uniform. So we need to adapt our social institutions. We have maternity leave, and now we're introducing paternity leave. I think there's all sorts of things that can be done along a similar lines for re-education vouchers, training vouchers. We also need to make sure that firms have a role to play here. firms have a very big role to play in helping people cope with their future. And so there's a thing called the midlife MOT that's been introduced by some companies in the UK, where people in their 40s and 50s on a voluntary basis attend 4 short seminars that says, hey, what is your future planning? Have you got the skills for it? What is your health? What are your relationships? How do you support that? And I think firms have got a very big role to play here. Just as firms had a big role to play in developing occupational pensions, I think they have a big role to play in introducing policies that help say, you know what, you've got an elderly relative who needs caring, you can work flexibly. You're trying to raise a young family, I will let you work flexibly. You need a shift and a change, I will help you do that. So I think, you know, again, we're going to see some firms do it because they really value their workers. Other firms not do it. So there may need to be government regulation to branch this out. And I do think inclusion is going to be a major challenge. If you look at what we had in the 20th century, we saw tremendous falls in infant mortality because of a tremendous public health program that said we need to make these benefits available to everyone. I think we need to do the same thing for people in their 50s as well, to narrow the huge regional and income inequalities in health that exist. We need a pretty major public health campaign around age 50 to help people have a health platform that when they get into their 70s and 80s is a supportive one.
Thank you. I think last question about this book was about sort of loneliness. You mentioned that there's a lot of changing notions around family and friends. And although we know from multiple publications that one of the best predictors of lifespan is your quality and number of social connections, and also happy life, you mentioned more and more old people live alone in Western society, and we're increasingly age segregated, which kind of is directly opposite to some other cultures, let's say those of Asian cultures. I mean, what can we do? Can we learn something from them?
So I think this is really hard, but I think on one level, it's so there's different takes on this. So one is what happens, what are people's connections, and undoubtedly the 3-stage life of education, work, retirement has led to a lot of age segregation. And that's particularly the case in countries like the US and the UK, less pronounced elsewhere, but you know, UK has or England at least has a very long tradition of small households in terms of size, which means that you get lots of age segregation. Then there's this sort of politics of generational conflict that everyone seems to really like and play into. I think what's interesting, if you look at, was it Ben Page's book on generations? So if you look at actually people's attitudes, there's really not much generational conflict. People are pretty understanding about different age groups, despite what they read in the press and the media. So actually, I think there's a lot of goodwill, both flowing from old to young and young to old. So if there is that, then I think we've got some hope. I actually think the biggest problem is probably with older generations. I'll throw myself into that group, than younger generations. I think it's this notion of this is where I'm comfortable, this is who I spend my time with, that has to be changed. I think there's various ways of doing it. You're seeing various social entrepreneurships trying to do it. So Encore in the States, Common Room here in the UK. But I think it's actually about community and town planning, I think. You know, it always strikes me as one of the great questions of the 20th century is how did America, which was such a community-based society, end up being such a consumer-based society? So if we went from one way to the other, how do we go back again? I do think things like working from home offer a very interesting opportunity. So the book, The 100-Year Life, we followed up with A New Long Life, which was trying to bring technology and work together, technology and demography together. And so how can we use both of these longer lives and technology to build a better life? And if we spend less time physically at work, then actually our cohort becomes very different. It can be much more important to base yourself in the community and your family. So I'm hoping that'll be one of the consequences of some of the work from home shifts that clearly will build up over time, and the use of technology. It's also in a multi-stage life. If you aren't always working in the same company, yet again, your work colleagues will be less important to you because you will have to have an identity outside of that. And I think that's really one of the things that a three-stage life has done. It's, for a lot of people, it's meant that the job is their identity, and that's led to lots of age segregation and lots of less community. I'm very wary that I'm just basically saying that everything's going to change. We've gone one way very far, and we're now going to go back another way. But I do think that that's sort of the mood. I mean, if I look at the Industrial Revolution, you had technology changes that were working for businesses but weren't working for society. And you had massive social protests, developments of trade unions, development of things like the Salvation Army, etc., all of which said, let's try and design a better society that works for us and not just for business. And I'm hoping that's what's going to start to happen with longevity and technology. There's certainly the political tensions around suggest that something is happening.
Well, thank you. That's very optimistic. Just really briefly before we get to the Q&A, what is it you're working on currently? What is most interesting to you right now?
Well, I mean, congratulations on being interested in longevity, because the space is just exploding. I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, it really does feel that more and more people are interested in it. I still think it's a long haul. It's like water on a stone dripping away that eventually has the impact that you want. But there's sort of three things that I'm doing. One is I'm working on a new book, a book on my own called Evergreen, which it sort of says, along the lines of what we're talking about, we have a new human imperative. Now the young can expect to become old to age well. And that's not about what you do when you're old. It's not about the silver economy. It's about the evergreen economy. I will spend a lot to have someone look after me if I need a care home or dementia, but I will spend a fortune to avoid being put in a care home and getting dementia. So there will be an evergreen economy and an evergreen society focused on this new imperative of aging well. And it just paints a picture of what that means and how to achieve it. Then I'm very much trying to get my own profession, economics, to be interested in this topic, to have a proper theory of longevity that really starts to think, what do longer lives mean? How do people change as they get older in a way that's separate from their health? And how do we then start to think about what to do with these extra years of life? How do we allocate resources around them? So they're the sort of the two big things I'm throwing myself into. You have the Longevity Society. Please do go to look at the Longevity Forum as well and sign up there, because we run a whole bunch of interesting events I think that you'd find very interesting. You're welcome to attend.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. I mean, that was really exciting. Good luck with your future work. And I will now pass to Brendan for the questions. We have some questions in the chat. Brendan, I just remember, I think you might need to unmute people or for them to be able to talk.
Oh, okay. Great. Yeah, we have a lot of questions in the chat. First question coming from Christopher Mosley. Do you want to ask your question, Christopher? I'm also very happy to read out the question.
Hi. Yes. Sorry, couldn't get the unmute. Well, actually, I was just going to ask the question for making a slightly cheeky observation that there was an actress, well-known actress in Britain, who said that she's looking forward to working well into her older age on a Zimmer frame, assisted walking, and that's great for Brenda. But what about those who, are doing the complicated math to work out how you're going to string out retirement and have an enjoyable life? I know that's a responsibility on all of us, but I'm just wondering whether you have that kind of perspective on the kind of large number of us who are sort of planning how we're going to manage that if we're going to live that much longer.
No, this is the challenge, isn't it, Christopher? So thank you for the question. Thank you for joining tonight. Okay, so let me try and answer this in different ways. The first is, I think what is so interesting about this older age, longer life we're living, is that it reveals all the problems we've got across all of life, which is there's just massive inequality. And, what I think is interesting is that lot of governments have got policies that say, oh, what do we do with the over 65s? As if they're a uniform bunch, but they're not. And so just as we have to worry about what happens to people from 25 to 65, are they having good jobs? Are they getting looked after? Have they got good pay? Is it a good life? We have all the same problems that go on from 65 plus. So actually, I think we need to subsume working policy for older workers in the same with everybody else. It's not policies for over 65. It's just a continuation right the way through. Then your second problem is, how do we get people to realize the challenge? Because, if they don't, then they themselves won't be prepared for it. And that's a real problem. So I do think we need to do much better at trying to get people to be aware of life expectancy trends. And then, I think the question you're just saying more is, how do I, when I'm older, find something that is interesting and productive to do? And we need more options for that, for sure. So that is about designing jobs. So I'm doing some work at the moment on designing an age-friendly job index, which is, we know that as people get older, they want to do different types of jobs. How do we create those jobs? And I don't think all of them need to be bad jobs. We need to have jobs that are suitable for older people that they can do. And that has to be a question of design. So I think there's lots to be done. I think the other thing I'm very keen we do is we recognize that not everyone is living longer lives in good health. And retirement was one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. And we've got to be really careful we don't just raise the state pension age to a point where for a certain group in society, they get no retirement. I think that would be a terrible thing. So I think we have to have a much more nuanced approach to retirement age and try and give people incentives if they can to work for longer, but not insist that people do work for longer. And I like the Brenda Blethyn. I hadn't seen that one, so I like that one. She might not get in many films with the Zimmer frame though.
True.
Cool. So Sarah also has an interesting comment on how retirement is, the meaning of retirement is changing. Sarah, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi. Thanks so
Hi,
much,
Sarah.
Andrew. And your work is continuing to inspire me. I'm a career transition coach, and I do specialise quite a bit in the retirement stage, which has been quite disrupted in the last 2 years with people being made redundant and finding themselves retiring before they were expecting to, and all that brings. Now, what I find with clients is some of the first challenges we have to overcome together are the self-perception of aging, actually, and people that have had varied. I've worked with people who have had all sorts of different work life, but for people that have had very fulfilling, successful careers will sit there and suddenly their confidence, it's like it's dropped through the floor because of the word retirement, because of the association with aging, and that notion that they won't be considered if they wanted to go into a situation where they got a new job or reskilled. And actually, recent data and research has shown that they're right to some extent. There is a big problem in terms of recruitment and ageism. And I was just interested to find out from you, as a society, what we need to be doing to change perceptions, not just in terms of what society thinks, but how that impacts us as individuals too.
Yeah, no, I mean, great question. And I completely agree with everything you said, and I agree that retirement needs retiring in a sort of any easy sense. So the sense that there is a single retirement age where everyone at the same time comes to a hard stop at work has already gone. You can see it clearly in the marketplace. That doesn't mean that we know what's replaced it, but we know now people retire at very different ages. Often they also start to work part-time before they stop working at all, or they unretire. The percentage of older people who are in the gig economy is much higher than at other age groups, partly for some of the barriers you were talking about. actually think that the really big problem we've got in the labour market, it's one I try and sort of get government's attention for, is they always think that this is about changing the retirement age. People start dropping out from the labour market from age 50 onwards. And you see a really big dip from 50. And there is a bit of a drop at whatever you want to call retirement age now. But there's a gradual decline before then. And most people leaving the labour market from 50 onwards are not leaving it because they've accumulated so much money that they can afford to retire. They're doing it because they're in bad health, their partner or their parents are in bad health, or they've lost a job and they can't get in a new one. It's pretty clear, the evidence, that if you're old, you're discriminated against when you try and get rehired, which is why older people tend to then go in the job market. So loads of challenges to tackle there. But for me, it's about keeping people in employment beyond 50. That also, by the way, tackles Christopher's problem, which is, how do we get people working to 60, 70 or 80? Let's start by getting people working to 60. And that's about a whole bunch of issues. So in terms of how we tackle this, I think I'd also be a little bit more positive, which is, something's happening already. So in the 10 years before COVID, around 100% of G7 employment growth was coming about from people aged over 55. So a combination of a very big cohort and more of them wanting to work was really driving the labour market. So firms already are adapting. I think it's when you don't raise the issue of age, they just say carry on working. It's when the new hires come in that it's the problem. So, that there's some good news there. And in fact, I actually worry, because you've got some industries like academia or judges, the workforce is getting so old, it's kind of stopping jobs for the younger generation coming through. So there's a lot of challenges that need to be looked at. But how do we do it? Well, we're going to get more and more legislation that's going to tackle ageism in the workplace. Mark Zuckerberg said that years ago, that comment, young people are just smarter. You couldn't say that about any other demographic group. You shouldn't be able to say it about older people. So I think you'll start to see a lot more legislation. And of course, as the average voter gets older, you're going to see more support for that. I think you will start seeing, because of the shortage of workers, and it's very interesting what's happening right now. I'm really puzzled by the UK and US labour market data, because it shows that a large number of the Great Resignation is older people. And I'd like to know why, because it's not that their finances are any stronger. So there's something, it could be about health and COVID, but that's going to create a real problem in the labour market, because there's just not enough workers. And as immigration gets less, as the birth rates are getting lower, firms will have to start to focus on those older workers. But it is about programs that try and connect firms with workers. And then, as you said about coaching, I think it's a great area to be in, because trying to get people to unwind ageist assumptions and also recognize the talents they've got and how they can shift into different areas is going to be really key. So that part of that multi-stage life is definitely people such as yourself helping people in their 50s and 60s and beyond to find new jobs. Just on a personal note, my mother-in-law, who is 82, I think I can say that, she probably doesn't want me to. She lives in the US. She's just left one job and is trying to find a new one. So, that's quite extraordinary to be 82 and looking for a new job. But she wants something part-time, she wants something stimulating, and she's worried where she can find it. That's rather extreme compared to the 50s and 60s, but it is a problem we're going to have more and more of.
Okay, great. Yeah, we have at least 3 more.
Yeah, it's fine. I'm happy to carry on.
Questions. So, Avi Roy, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I'm just trying to lower my hand. Andrew, thank you for the wonderful talk. I apologize that I came in late, but I also want to say that recently read your paper, The Longevity Society, which you published in the Lancet's journal, and that was quite fantastic. So I'm a biomedical scientist, not qualified to talk about the question that I'm asking about, but I'm going to ask anyway, which is that there are a lot of tools that we use to incentivize young people, whether it be nation states incentivizing younger people to move over in peak reproductive age, or the skills-based employment schemes that there are that score people on their degrees and so forth and so on. As the population, as your paper shows, the first figure itself, the global population and age dynamics, and as the population pyramid changes, do you know of tools that are currently being deployed by any government anywhere that are trying to incentivize the other end of the spectrum, whether to keep them in jobs longer? I mean, I know that you have been talking about some of these things already, or to incentivize retooling. I mean, you just talked about your mother-in-law, but she's really an exception. I'm here in Oxford, sorry, Cambridgians. But so on, all of the professors here, my professors here are 70, 80 years old, and they're still going strong. But outside of those bubbles, are there any schemes that are trying to actually incentivize longer time, longer health span, and trying to motivate those kind of things? I hope that question made any sense.
Yeah, no, so it does. And obviously, key to all of this being active and engaged, whether that's in a working job or just being engaged, is good health. So, key is health span. And is enough being done about that? No, we still have an attitude of just intervening when people get ill. So I do think a major public health program aimed at focusing on getting people aware of the value of keeping up their health for the years ahead is key. So I don't think enough is being done on that. Of course, then you also need to make sure you have the jobs. And I talked about the age-friendly nature of jobs. I think just greater awareness of that will itself start to create, because firms want to know how to make, they're starting to worry about losing skilled workers because of demographic trends, and particularly in things like manufacturing and construction and agriculture, which have a very old workforce. There's a real problem of skills walking out the door and nothing coming in to replace it. Then you've got some initiatives around lifelong learning. Singapore is always the obvious place to refer to, because Singapore has got some grants and vouchers for lifelong learning, which seem to work quite well. But again, if you think about Cambridge, LBS is a bit different, but we still focus education very much on people aged 18 to 21. And quite when universities are recognised, there's an enormous market from 21 to 65, 70, and they should be tapping into it. It's going to be interesting, but it requires different ways of teaching. So we're behind the curve in that way. But I think your point about countries offering incentives is very interesting. And I can't really say, but yeah, I've been talking to a couple of governments about longevity strategies recently, and they are very interested in now changing the type of people they apply incentives to, and are very keen to bring in, to keep for longer older workers, of course, those with high skills and high wealth. So that doesn't solve the problem at the other end of the distribution. But there is an enormous role for governments to play here. But yeah, some governments are even thinking about incentives. And of course, there will be lots of countries looking to offer come and stay and retire in my country, if you've got the wealth and the facilities. So there will be a lot of competition in that space as well.
Cool. So Lucas also has a so touching upon the AI topic that you mentioned in your book, The 100-Year Life. He's saying, given the broad automation and lifespan extension are on the horizon, what are some of the solutions you envision for this nascent problem of more people with fewer jobs besides something like universal basic income?
So thank you, Lucas. And yeah, the book, The New Long Life, looks at quite a lot of questions here, the intersection between longevity and technology. In response to 100-Year Life, one of the questions we got was, where are all the jobs going to come from? And then, of course, you throw in technology, people say there's even fewer jobs. I mean, on that, just sort of two things. Of course, if people work for longer and earn more, they spend more, and that creates jobs. There's not, the old people working doesn't necessarily make younger people unemployed. I think there's career issues. So certain jobs may be taken, but in terms of unemployment, older people working more does not create youth unemployment. So I'm very relaxed on that. I think there's all sorts of issues about how we design careers and jobs within it. And then on technology, I mean, there's a huge debate here about whether technology will or won't lead to fewer jobs. Obviously, in the past, technology hasn't created unemployment, but there's a worry that this time it's different. My good friend Darren Asimoglu, actually I'm doing some work on in the aging space now around labour markets. Well, there's a great book coming out later this year, and he's always worth reading. I think he's got it right. He says, you know, technology can do two things. It can automate, so it can take away a job, or it can augment and make your job better and more productive and just nicer to do. And you know, whether technology displaces jobs or has a bad social effect will be dependent upon the channels of automation versus augmentation. And that isn't something that happens automatically. It's things like the tax system that encourages firms at the moment to do automation rather than augmentation. So there's a whole bunch of policies that we need to put in place. And I think Darren's particularly good in saying that there's a sort of Silicon Valley notion that says machines are good and humans are flawed. Therefore, let's have more machines and fewer humans. That's a disastrous route to take if we're going down that route. So we have to make sure we have policies and incentives that make technology, make jobs better, enable us to do more human things in our jobs. So I actually think, you know, if we have the right policies, just like all previous forms of technology, this may not be fewer jobs. It should then be jobs with fewer hours. However, you know, we may go down the route of major job losses. So then, yeah, UBI seems the obvious way to go. I'm not a great fan of UBI, and there's sort of two reasons, one economic, one less. One is, I just think we won't afford it. I mean, you should target benefits to those who need it the most rather than give the same to everyone. So I don't like the universal nation. It just seems the UBI would be incredibly expensive and poorly targeted. Of course, there are lots of benefits that already do that benefit the rich rather than the poor, but I would rather focus on need. You know, it's the same with pensions. We have a kind of a universal basic income if you're above a certain age, but we tax it back. So I'm sort of nervous about UBI in terms of coverage and focus. But the other thing I think is just really, really important is to have a cohesive society. You need to have people who feel they're contributing in some way and in some meaningful way. And that is about good jobs. We still don't have a better way of doing it. And, you know, it may be that if there's machines can do all the work, we can find roles for ourselves within the community. But I think actually democracy and prosperity requires the feeling that I've got something useful to do, something that engages me. And whether you are valued in your job, both sociologically and also in terms of the pay you get. So I think I'd rather focus not on how do I compensate you when you haven't got a job, but how do I make sure that we have AI and robotics that actually augments workers so that we want more workers. So that, you know, the standard example here, if it sounds a bit mystic, is that you know, AI can come along and take away parts of jobs that are repetitive and dull, but we can then expand the rest of the job into something that's more valuable for the individual and the purpose. So when ATMs were introduced, banks thought they'd get rid of lots of cashiers because they didn't need them to hand out money, but they found out that actually the people now going into banks to deal with cashiers had more complicated, more interesting and more valuable tasks to do. So they actually wanted more cashiers. Similarly, you know, Excel spreadsheets or VisiCalc, which was the first spreadsheet, got rid of loads of book clerks, but replaced them with even more accountants because we moved away from doing pure number crunching to now doing more analysis. So I think it's about how we encourage firms not to do automation, but to do augmentation. And there's plenty of scope for that, plenty of scope.
Yeah, absolutely. So final question is from Levin. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Hi. Thank you for a very, very interesting talk, interview, dialogue. My question was basically thinking about what is the biggest bottleneck for the longevity research today, from your perspective? And if it is funding, what if you were to imagine that that is out of the way, so we get all the money? What's the next biggest thing? Is it regulations in terms of the type of experiments we can do, or the perception of the public about how important it is, or what? Thank you.
So really great question. So I mean, all the scientists say we just need more money. And yeah, that will speed up the research, and the research will come through with quicker with proposals. I think there's loads of things we're not ready for yet. And I see that not just in the science, but also in the social science. So even though, I said longevity is booming at the moment, I think one of the biggest dangers we've got with longevity is the governments think that it's easy. I mean, all the questions you've been throwing me, they're hard. I haven't got simple answers to them. There's various things I would do and focus on straight away. But actually, the whole system needs to change, and it's not obvious how to change it, and it's complicated. So I'm kind of hoping we don't make too much progress too rapidly. What I have noticed the last 3 or 4 years is it's gone from governments and firms not being interested in the topic to suddenly getting more and more interested in it. And I worry they're going to turn around soon and say, right, what do we do? Tell me, here's a blank check. And I think there's loads of things we don't yet know what to do. And the science certainly is not at a stage where I think you should be writing blank checks. It's still very early days science. Things will come from it, but it's still early days. That then gives us time. You talked about research regulation. You'll be aware, I don't know if you've got Nir Barzilai to talk to you at some point, but he's great on the whole regulatory issues, which is that, aging not being a disease, it's very hard to actually work out what a success of a trial is. So I think
who did you mention? Sorry?
Nir Barzilai. So he's running the TAME trial in Albert Einstein College with the metformin. And Nir is the one who I think has been having the longest conversations with the FDA about what counts as a success for an aging drug. I mean, you'll be aware that right now, partly because aging is not a disease, you can't actually do a trial for age protective effects. You can say, I'm looking at the effect of this drug on cardiovascular disease, on cancer or dementia, but you cannot test anything for aging. So that's a pretty big regulatory hurdle to try and overcome, because that means you can only say, we're just testing for dementia, we're just testing for cardiovascular. And of course, whenever you get a success on dementia or cardiovascular, you stop the trial. So you don't really know what it's doing around aging. I think that for me, I'll go back, and I guess it's what I'm trying to do in my work. So perhaps it's why I say this. It's the public perception on the importance of longevity. People just don't understand it. They think, forget about what may happen with the science. They don't understand where we are now. They're not aware of the gains to life expectancy that have occurred. Even the government focuses upon period, not cohort measures of life expectancy, which understates what people can expect. People are still by and large behaving based on a life expectancy that is no longer there. And, there's just this misconception that aging is about end of life, that aging is fixed, and there aren't things that can be done about it. And I think raising the public perception that actually you will live a longer life, looking at the odds, you need to prepare yourself differently. And how do you do that? And it's really hard. I'm certainly not one of these uber disciplined people who is brilliant at managing my longevity. Some things I'm doing well on, some things I'm not, because it's really hard given the way when I walk around a supermarket, when I live my life, when I travel, to do many of the things that are needed to support a good, healthy, long life. So I think it's the public perception. But I'm pretty convinced that once you start to change the public perception or awareness of the issue, it starts to change. You tell most people about aging society and they worry about dementia. I kind of get that. But looking at the stats, only 1 in 11 people will get dementia. Your risk of getting dementia at every age is declining. And there's things that you can do. We know that, for instance, education is a great protective against dementia. So how do we raise awareness of these issues, that there are things that can be done to improve future outcomes? So that, I think, is the key. And what I liked about the success of the 100-year life, it was remorselessly positive, which isn't always my natural instinct, but it is, it starts to get people interested in a different way in the topic, and start to say, oh, okay, there may be positives. Yeah, there's challenges, lots and lots of challenges, but how do I get the positives, and how do I start preparing for it? So I think that, to me, is the key. Sorry, I'm just going to turn my phone off. Yeah, so I would say it's raising awareness of the issue, and that it is not all about end of life. It is not. Most people do not get dementia. So how do you structure things differently? That, for me, is the key. Every day I just find we're so messed up with the world. It's because we think of chronological age, and because we have old-fashioned age stereotypes, that we struggle with this topic enormously. Just go back. Age is malleable. That's what you're doing with the science. But that's not people's natural instinct. They think aging is inevitable.
Thank you.
Great. Andrew, thanks very much for giving us your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you at our next event in May by Malike Doniertas.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck. Keep in touch. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.